Okay, I'll open the floor for a JEA workshop to discuss the issue of privatization. Ironically, I suspect that members of the media and most members of the public think that the JEA board has been discussing this for weeks and weeks because everybody else has, but that's simply not the case. The JEA board has not yet had an opportunity to discuss in full session the issue of privatization. So last month's February board meeting, we called for this workshop as an opportunity for the JEA board to discuss the issues around privatization. I've asked staff to make a report today on some of the issues. I note that it's almost as thick as the annual disclosure report. I hope we're not going to have to go through every single page. This is, for the members of the board, an opportunity for us to discuss with staff and amongst ourselves the issues surrounding privatization. While they will be making a report, I'm going to go ahead and tell everyone, feel free to look to be recognized, to interrupt, so that you have an opportunity to discuss a topic as it's being presented. I'm going to feel free to do that, and I'll invite you to get my attention so that you should feel free to do that as well. This is scheduled for 60 minutes, but if it takes longer, it takes longer. We'll be here as long as it takes to make sure that board members' questions are answered, and staff will endeavor to provide those answers at this meeting, or if not, immediately following that. I would like to take a moment to recognize and thank for their attendance. I saw Council President Anna Lopez-Brochet in the back, Council Vice President Bowman, saw him over there, Councilman Crescenbenny, Councilman Joyce Morgan, Schellenberg we saw, and did I see Councilman Love back there? Great. So all of you are welcome. Did I miss any of our members of City Council? If so, I apologize. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate your attendance. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. McElroy and Ms. Dykes to present the report. Talking points.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate your remarks, because going back just a month ago, the intent here was that the suggestion was a workshop. You and your leadership addressed each board member, and I think we had a unanimous support to have this dialogue. And so while you have material in front of you that might be construed as a presentation, its intent is really to provide some material for discussion. Today's conversation and discussion is not meant to replace or replicate any of the great work of the City Council. I mean, that work is going to go on. Ultimately, the City Council is the body that will be the final arbiter, as they have been through the history since consolidation when this issue has come up. If anything, it's meant to complement, it's meant to stimulate further conversation within the community. It's meant to point out some paths we might take, and to point out some risks, as well as opportunities. So I think right now our objective in the work that we've done in terms of pulling together some information today is to really stimulate some dialogue. And so thank you for allowing us this time. First and foremost, I want to address a number of our employees that are here and that are probably watching today. We are streaming this live, and recognize to them that I know this is probably the most difficult time that they've been through over the last 90 days. We have tried to communicate openly. We'll continue and have made that commitment to communicate openly to them as much information as we have available. As soon as it becomes available, we will try to clarify misconceptions as quickly as they arrive. I understand this, and I do want to point to the board chair. He recognized this up front and said that if we were going to move down this path after Mr. Petway introduced this concept, then we should do it on an accelerated basis to be mindful of the disruption that this causes in the workforce and with our employees. So I wanted to make that point clear for our conversation as we go forward. The first thing we thought I would do is introduce in your packet, and we're not going to go through the whole packet, but we did provide you with copies of materials that we provided to the City Council last week. We provided a copy of the board strategic plan presentation that was dated in October of 2013. We provided the American Public Power Association, that's 1,400 public power associations or public power companies across the country, and actually across the globe, a benchmarking study against about 25 key operating metrics and how we compare as a utility in similarly sized municipal power. We have...
It's behind the first tab in your binder.
Okay. A rating agency, key financial metrics. There's a slide there that covers 2013 through 2017. We felt it really important. What we heard in one of the early workshops was concern about the amount of cash at JEA. We have been fully transparent about our reserves, our balance sheet, and our cash since May 7th of 2012. We provide on a quarterly basis a 20-plus page analysis to the Finance and Audit Committee and ultimately the board, which covers every reserve dollar we have on the balance sheet. Each reserve is segmented. There's a definition of each reserve. There's an expectation of each reserve. There's a historical view and a projection. We have also provided 2 rating agencies report, one for the water and sewer business. Moody's did that, and what we picked was the rating agencies. They're pretty tightly grouped in terms of the evaluation of JEA, both on the water and the sewer side, but we can pick one with the strongest rating and one probably with the weakest view. And we picked the weakest view, Moody's for water and sewer, as S&P has us rated AAA in this sector, and the same in the electric system, S&P. So rather than send over 6 reports, we just picked 2 and forwarded those. This week, we will be producing, at the request of what we heard, a free cash flow analysis, and that looks to derive from our income statements a cash flow number, free cash flow. It's free of interest, principal, and contribution, and so it's sort of a proxy, if you will, for the public sector a pre-tax income. Before dividend interest and amortization, et cetera. So it was an evaluation that worked very closely with the council order on in terms of the format. Storm cost and FEMA reimbursement, both in terms of what we did and really historically a few benchmarks within the state. Philanthropic expenditures associated with the relationships we have with the many nonprofits and organizations within the community. And we've included a full workup on our net revenue task force. This was part of our strategic planning. Our strategic planning early on that was launched in late 2013 had a key strategy to focus on growing revenues. We put together a task force. That task force studied and recommended well over a dozen items. We saw one here today was finally approved and trying to make its way forward. And so we looked at least a dozen, I think it's probably closer to the high teens, in evaluating ways to lever existing assets and maybe ways that we might be able to potentially grow new business opportunities. And so that will be forthcoming, and we'll be releasing that, if we haven't released it, potentially even today. So that's a little background. The process we've gone through, the 28th, Mr. Petway introduced. The 5th, Chair Howard directed staff to evaluate this position, again, with extreme sensitivity to our employees in terms of the accelerated path. The chair brought on a discussion at the December 12th JEA board meeting. On the 7th of February, a draft report of PFM was distributed through to the community. The 14th, there was a meeting between the City Council and the board where PFM presented and released the full report that they had of the study. On the 20th of February, the council meeting was formed, and we're here today. So the framework on page 4, and really deferring a little bit to the chair on this, here's sort of an outline of what we suggested maybe a conversation might cover. Looking at some of the great operating performance, there's a page or two there. Reviewing some electric industry trends, some water and sewer industry trends. some contribution analysis to put that in historical perspective, as well as some of the partnerships we've had with the city of Jacksonville over a number of years. I think it's important to understand the sort of the capital markets and the dynamics that are occurring or have occurred in the past 12 to 36 months in the capital markets. There was one particular question that came out of the meeting on the 14th with respect to the valuation, and that was, were you able to segment those valuation dollars between electric and water sewer? And we've got a chart that presents that information. We have some possible structures. I mean, you know, what does this mean in terms of, we talk about these big dollars, but what does this mean? And then maybe just scratching the surface on what this might mean prospective. And there's a full range there from possible structures of a do nothing to 3 or 4 other possible outcomes. And then recognizing some of the challenges that we have. And first and foremost, I believe, in terms of the employee population, our customers, the community at large, continue to struggle with the conversation. I think, Melissa, I'll steal her thunder. There's no free question in this conversation. Every question has an impact, and we need to be mindful of that. So with the chair and really looking at the rest of it, that's a big overview. But I thought I'm going to hit the pause button here and give others an opportunity to say, are we on the right path? Should we continue forward? Do you want to comment now and leave this? Because this is not intended to be the CEO's presentation. This is intended to be the board's time to discuss.
Thank you, Paul. We all appreciate discussion as opposed to speechifying, so thank you. I think that this is the right summary of topics to be addressed today. I think you've got it in a coherent and logical order. I would invite introductory remarks from any of my fellow directors, but following that, I'd like for you to walk us through current JEA financial metrics, where we are in terms of achieving peak performance, the trends, and the other issues that you've outlined here in your framework. With that, I'll open it for introductory remarks. Mr. Cumber?
You know, I don't have any kind of extensive remarks. What I would like to say is, you know, from my perspective, I think this discussion we're having, and I would hope, Paul, you and your colleagues recognize this, is not a reflection on something JE employees have not done or have done over the last few decades. I think it's a conversation that's more grounded in the fact of, you know, where the industry as a whole is going. And I know that there's, you know, a lot of discussion out there that that this may be a reflection on employees themselves, and I would hope that that's not how they're interpreting this. What I'm hopeful of this conversation is, you know, in my mind, 3 things. One is, I'll be the first to admit that I'm still confused with what the actual process is, you know, in the sense of, you know, at what point does the JEA board need to make a decision or a recommendation to the city? Do we even have, you know, is that even part of the process? And so just kind of understanding that and the timeline of how all of that will play out. Number 2 is just, you know, what's happening in the industry itself. You know, and we all kind of bring our personal backgrounds to these conversations. You know, we're in the business of owning monopolies, right? I mean, we own railroads, for example. And the only time that I would think you'd want to sell a monopoly is when that monopoly is threatened. And so what I hope to gain out of this is kind of an understanding where the utility industry is going. And I come to it with a very simplified way of approaching it is, we provide $117 million to the city starting next fiscal year. I think that's what we have in our budget, if I remember that correctly. And if someone were to make a motion at the meeting to contribute $117 million to the city in perpetuity, my assumption is management would come and say, well, we can't do that. Like, we can't make the $117 million a floor because we don't know where the industry is going. And so, you know, 10, 20 years ago, the conversation was always, you're going to get more homes, people are going to use more electricity, revenues are going to continue to go up. And it was just kind of this steady growth. And so I think it behooves us to to recognize the fact that we contribute such a significant part of city revenues that I don't want to wake up and realize 10, 20 years from now, if the utility industry gets shaken up, and now we're only able to contribute a fraction of that 117, I think we all have to recognize that that also puts a lot of pressure on the city as well and the services it provides. And then the third thing that I would mention is I recognize that we've got conversations about pension issues. There's conversations about, promises that have been made, whether in writing or not in writing. I think it also is just helpful to understand all the different liabilities that are sitting on JEA's books. So we're not just talking about, what the sale price could be, but really truly understanding what the net of this would be, and recognizing that, there are pension issues, there are other issues such as that we need to just get our arms around that are not easy 30-second soundbite answers. And so I'm hoping to kind of get into that at some point.
Thank you, Mr. Cumber. Ms. Flanagan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the clarification to the public at large that this is indeed the first opportunity that we, the board, are having to discuss the topic with one another. So it's certainly too early to have an informed individual opinion either for or against privatization, but I do believe that as a board member and as a board as the whole, we owe a fiduciary responsibility in our custodian responsibilities of this great asset to have an understanding for its value. And I understand that this question has been looked at times in past before, and that the environmental conditions have changed since the last time this question was asked. So I'm supportive of going through the process and understanding it, but stopping short of having a position for the direction that it heads after that. I would echo Director Cumber's request for further clarification in terms of the board's role in this process, and is our role concluded with assessing the value, or is it on us to form a cohesive recommendation for moving forward?
Thank you. Before we move on to Revenue Bill, just to Ms. Brooks, as our Chief Legal Officer, in response to at least two directors' question, would you please consult with your colleagues and report back to the board on what our role would be, understanding that City Council under the Charter is required to approve any disposition of 10% or more of JEA's assets. Educate the board as to our role and responsibility if that decision were to be made to move forward.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I will get with Jason Gabriel had drafted a process memo that I assisted with. My name's on that process memo, and I'm not sure if this entire board has received that process memo. So I'll at least get the process memo circulated to this board. It'll help potentially answer some of the questions. I don't think it will thoroughly answer what the true JEA board's role is, but I'll get that responded to.
Thank you. Again, just for everybody to be clear on this is not a foregone conclusion. That's a request made just to give us some information and guidance. No one's saying that decision's been made and now we need to know when we vote. Revenue Bill.
Mr. Chair, I don't want to be redundant, but certainly I want to echo what was said by our previous two board members. I thought I had missed something from hearing what was going on in the community, in the newspaper, and I'm saying, well, I'm a board member, and this is the first time I've heard of it, other than Mr. Petway asking us to consider taking a look at it. And so this is the first time, as a board, that we've addressed this issue, and I think that's the confusion. In this community, people are some pro, some con, but there's something going on in this community that's not necessary, because they think that somehow we've met and made a decision as it relates to the board, and so it's not clear. It's not even clear to the fact that we don't make the last decision to sell JEA. That's City Council. And so there's just a lot of mix-ups, and I think that it would behoove all of us, every opportunity we get, to try to clarify, where we are and where we're not. Thank you.
Thank you, Revenue Bill. Ms. Green?
I almost want to say ditto, because that's exactly what I wrote on my notes. I wanted to thank Councilman Schellenberg for recommending the workshop, because I saw this as a huge opportunity as board members for us to really understand the details of the process, as well as the true valuation of JEA. And being a fairly new board member, even through documentation, I think that if we are provided as much documentation in advance, I think that was something that came up in the last board meeting as well, that if we could have all of the information that we needed, we could come prepared. We could come prepared, and it's not just a presentation of information. And as everyone else has echoed, my fellow board members, is that we have a responsibility to City Council as well as the employees and the ratepayers.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Zahn?
You want to talk about a new board member, right?
Welcome.
So first, let me apologize, because this might be a little bit long-winded. However, I promise you I will not make a practice of this. But given the fact that I've been able to take notes for the last 3 or 4 months as a bystander and watch the ongoing conversation, I just have some observations that maybe other people too close to the fire might not have. Simple overarching observation: in 2007, JEA was valued at $3.1 billion. In 2012, it was valued at $1.2 billion, representing a loss of 50% of the value. In 2018, the most recent evaluation or evaluation, whichever it is, but an estimate of value, let's put it that way, is a little over $6 billion, meaning that the management team and board that has been in place since 2012 and 2018 has increased value by around 5 times. I wish my stocks had done the same in that time. In parallel with this, if you read the board reports, JEA has improved on its industry standard operating metrics, and it's dealt with historic storm events. So I'm going to pause, and I'm going to say thank you very much to the board and to all of the employees, frontline and executive, for that performance, because we could all hope for that type of performance in the next 5 to 10 years.
And paid down debt.
All of this is in the is actually, in fact, in the face of a trend that started in 2007. So our electrical sales have decreased by 10%, our water sales have decreased by 14%, and these were are in direct opposite compared to the last 50 years, where they have been increasing 3 to 5% respectively. So there's a philosophical challenge I think this board actually really does have, and it's one that in the February 14th City Council meeting, which I'm sure all of us can't forget, Councilman Hazuri contemplated the following question: so what's broken? And in fact, Councilman Becton contemplated an even more important philosophical question, which is, why are we having this conversation? And I think analyzing history is really good for obtaining experience and kind of a retrospective viewpoint. However, rarely does that retrospective viewpoint provide a good, perfect blueprint for the future planning and management, which I think is the onus of the management team. So new challenges, which we've talked about, face JEA with regards to their business model, their policies, and how management deals with the remarkable pace of change within our industry as well as within the technologies. Great opportunities and risks actually exist within that, and Paul and I have discussed many of that. Point in case, actually between February and this month's board meeting, if you look at the photovoltaic install just in our backyard, has grown 75% year over year in the last 4 years. If that trend continues, then that means that our electrical sales may have, I'd hate to see what our forecast budget looked like if that trend continued. And,
Is that Florida, the PV sales?
No, that's in our backyard. That's in our
Northeast
service
Florida.
area. That's
Service area?
in our service area. It has grown 75% year over year from 1 megawatt to, it was 11.7 in my notes from February, but it's now 12.8. So actually, we've grown another 10% in 1 month. And you have overnight multi-billion-dollar companies like Amazon, Tesla, Google, Uber, and Airbnb, all of which actually are now power companies. In fact, Microsoft is now a power company. And this is, now they're cutting-edge leaders, and they're impacting and disrupting UPS, NASA, GE, GM, and other industries around transportation, hospitality, and groceries. And again, I apologize in advance. So I look at what might be a path forward, and it's not necessarily a process question, more of a business one. Mr. Petway asked a series of really good poignant questions, and the exact questions were, can customers be better served by a private marketplace? Will the city benefit financially from privatization? It seems to me that as a collective public, we jumped right to the conversation of sell versus don't sell. And I think we should stop that conversation. In fact, I would submit that this board of directors, it's our fiduciary responsibility to take a more pragmatic and deliberate course and fulfill our fiduciary responsibilities in the following. We should design a process that allows for us to produce a strategic plan for 2028. How is this authority going to run its business for the next 10 years? The framework upon which could be very simple. 6 points. Number one, how does this authority continue, in whatever form it takes, provide the best possible essential services for our community? Number two, how does this authority, in whatever form it takes, serve the numerous stakeholders of JEA? Number three, how do we preserve the $6 billion of value that is currently estimated to be the value of JEA and not see a repeat performance of 2007 to 2012? Because value begets bond ratings, which begets weighted average cost of capital, which begets the ability to actually provide good services. Number four, how do we design a business that actually continues a reasonable and targeted growth rate of that value? Think of it like a share value. Number five, how do we establish strategy and tactics to navigate the opportunities and risks inherent in the current and future marketplace? Number six, how do we limit the existing potential liabilities which may impair our value and our services? Perfect example of that is Plant Vogel, and I know the management team is dealing with that, but that's a perfect example of how a historical decision has long-term future ramifications, and the conversation we're having here as a board can have the same exact ramification if we don't make the right decision. So I've reviewed and as Paul knows as well, I've been a voracious reader over the last number of months. I've reviewed the 2013 strategic plan and annual updates. From my opinion, it's a solid plan. But it does not address many of the high-risk issues that are elevated in the enterprise risk management in terms of front-on, and nor does it truly contemplate the black swan event, which I would say seems today to be no longer an outlier event in the face of solar PV penetration, EV penetration, IoT, batteries, and I can go on a litany of other things that are impacting both power and water systems. So our monopoly is now afforded the luxury of time to plan to take advantage of such events. I think I'll repeat again, the executive team and the board at the time did a phenomenal job creating a 2013 plan, which is solid and that it creates a bedrock upon which we can build, and create another 10-year plan, which allows for us to make sure that we aren't disrupted, as Mr. Kummer, Director Kummer had pointed out. I think with a strategic plan like that in place, in fact, we could have a conversation around what the next 10 years look like, and from there, from strategic plans, in my experience, leads to conversation and capitalization, not the vice versa. Which is, I guess, why I feel in some respects the public discourse around capitalization versus how are we going to make sure we deliver all those 6 points to protect this asset for the city is significant. And then emerging out of that, I would suggest that the board actually could have the ability to communicate. So we would communicate that plan. We would get the feedback from our city council members and our administration, who are ultimately our shareholders in a different form and format. Do they agree with that framework of those 6 points? Are those, in fact, the right 6 points for this board to manage this asset for the next 10 years? And then we can work with the management team to, in fact, design a strategic plan that best addresses those 6 elements around a framework and present that back to the different stakeholders, which would be our customers, all of our employees, frontline to executive team, city individuals and corporate citizens, city government representatives, many of whom are here, as well as our commercial partners, including our banking institutions, as well as environmental and natural resource regulators, and in fact, maybe even put a punctuation mark, the next generations of Jacksonville. So I guess in summary, I look at it and say, yes, I'd love to know the process, but more what I'd like for this board to think about, and I know that no action gets taken here, is have we started jumping to sell versus don't sell versus answering a question of, which I think, Councilman Beckton asked, why are we even having this conversation, which I think the onus falls on us on this board and the management team to actually answer that question, and maybe we're a little too close to the actual operations of the business to be able to articulate that. Well, we know it implicitly by reading all the materials that we get week in and week out. It may not be as intuitive to all the other stakeholders that I outlined.
Thank you, Director Zahn, and all of the directors for their comments, particularly to Director Zahn. I applaud the obvious amount of thought that you've given to the points made here today in your introductory remarks. I think the call for a 10-year strategic plan, a new 10-year strategic plan for JEA, is laudable and deserving of a workshop all its own. Obviously, the development, socialization, and approval of such a plan would take some time. That's not the purpose for which this meeting's been called, but it's certainly a question worth asking and worth exploring further and with haste. I'm not sure that it can't take place in parallel to the current topic on the table, which is the potential for privatization of JEA, a topic that is being thoroughly debated by our city council and others within the community, and for which I think there is a responsibility of this group, this board, to weigh in. In response to your sort of threshold question, why did we jump to sell or don't sell? I think that the question asked by Mr. Petway prompted that discussion. It was certainly furthered by my call for evaluation. I'll use this as an opportunity to respond to the question that was asked of me at the February 14 meeting, and for which I perhaps didn't have the most robust answer, and that is, why did we order evaluation? I will tell you that I believe it is the fiduciary responsibility of this board to be forward-thinking, to evaluate the opportunities presented, particularly in a dynamic market where we've seen historic change take place on an accelerated basis. If the value had come back as it had in the past at $1 billion or less, we would have had no reason to go any further in this discussion. But as has been observed, the TICO Amira transaction 2 years ago was really an eye-opener, which suggested there was a tremendous amount of locked-in value at JEA that had not been, I think, vetted to the community. And I think that the PFM valuation, although it's been criticized by some, certainly gives a snapshot as to the potential value of JEA that makes this a discussion worth having. Again, if we were worth $1 billion and we're already putting $116 million a year into city coffers, we never would have had this discussion. But because of the potential value, net of liabilities, is $6 billion or more, then this is a discussion that the citizens of Jacksonville and our ratepayers are entitled to have us have, because it could be the right move at the right time with potentially transformative consequences for our city. So that's, I think, a more robust answer to the question of why are we having this discussion? That's why, because the market has changed. With those introductory remarks, I'm going to turn it back over to Paul, ask that he and Melissa sort of hit a summary of where JEA is today and what the trends are, and then maybe we'll hit the pause button again and allow the directors to respond to that first segment of your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, board members. And I'll move through this fairly quickly because it is intended to be background information. On page 5, we just picked 4 of many charts that exemplify, I think, the peak performance that JEA is achieving. Electric up in the top left, CME 5, we've talked about that. That is electric reliability performance. Bottom left, again, a reliability indicator, significantly better, and benchmarking well against investor-owned as well as substantially better than public powers nationwide. Top right, pressure within the system, and we have other metrics in terms of water, sewer, both systems performing at or near peak performance. Bottom right, the nationally acclaimed increase in improvement in customer satisfaction to top quartile levels in both areas, business and residential. And the business in 16 recognized as #1 in the country. The next two charts are really, can't be consumed in this environment. They are very loaded with information, but are intended to capture the historical view of debt and investment for JEA, both one chart and the first one is the electric system, and the second one is in the same format, the water system. Water and sewer system. You can see really since 2008, we've been able to, and from a ratings perspective and a stabilities perspective, we've been able to increase our credit ratings in the electric from 10 on. We have seen significant debt reduction over this period of time, and from 12 on, stable pricing for our customers and stable pricing out through 2020. So almost a decade of stable pricing while substantially reducing debt and improve financial metrics as indicated by the rating agencies' upgrades. We turn to the electric industry trends. The trends, we've got risks and opportunities. Clearly, there are risks in terms of the market structure. It certainly presents some level of uncertainty of what's going on, both in terms of locally as well as, and probably more importantly, nationally, driven by the federal regulations. Sales are flat. We've talked about that and/or declining here, but there are also opportunities to increase sales in the future. Renewable prices, opportunities of renewable prices are continuing to fall. We're seeing now potential solar prices coming in on a per megawatt hour basis less than our current fuel cost, fixed for a period of time. That is very significant. We didn't even expect that just 90 days ago. So market, in terms of renewable prices, pricing continues to fall. It provides economic opportunity for us for further investment and lowering our cost for business development and economy within Jacksonville. However, the flip side of that, it puts pressure on large fossil fuel plants like Northside 1, 2, and 3. So we've got some challenges there. Electric vehicles could play, and we have got one chart here which is really interesting in terms of the forecast. Electric vehicles could provide some additional demand for us if adopted in any widespread fashion. And technology developments, and we've got a slide on that, are across the board, and Director Zahn pointed out a number of them, which could have both a positive and negative impact in terms of just the overall operation of the grid and the distribution of electricity within our community. Market structure on the next slide, just to...
Can I just ask a question on that last
Sure,
one? Do you mind?
please.
Paul, could you go, or whoever's got the,
The back one.
on the first bullet of opportunities, just so I'm understanding that correctly. So renewable prices continue to fall, providing economic opportunity. I understand that. But disrupting model of large centralized fossil power plants, when you say that's an opportunity,
Well, it's the renewable is the opportunity, and probably the risk, if you will, is the disruption.
okay. I just wanted to make sure that being stuck with stranded costs on a centralized fossil power plant
It's not a good
With debt
idea.
is
It's
not
a
a good
bad
idea.
strategy.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And just to be clear,
Yeah.
the fossil power plants are 30-year plants with billions of dollars and long construction lead times, and that's where that stranded capital and costs get stuck.
Right.
How long does it take to throw up a 50 megawatt solar field?
I mean, they can throw that up in probably a month if it's pretty quick. I mean, and then it's plug and play wherever you go. So it's just now you got the storage and the battery and all that other good stuff, but and dispatchability and intermittent nature of renewables at this point. But technology is playing a bigger and bigger role in that, and other parts of the country are dealing with it very effectively at utility scale. So a market structure, our market structure in Florida and the Southeast is becoming. Is a unique creature. The rest of the country has either moved to organized markets or is in the process of moving towards organized markets. And that has called for the vertically integrated utility, which we are. We own generation, we have transmission, We interact with the market, we buy and sell power, and we have distribution to the home. And so what you'll see are the larger utilities in the, really now Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, New England, out through the Midwest and emerging now into the Western markets are regionalized marketplaces where there's generators, not even utilities, companies own the generation that's been sold off by most of the integrated utility companies. They maintain, transmission has been sold off or capitalized into regional transmission. They own distribution wires. And so the model in terms of the push and pull has been very different in the ability to collect rates and stranded costs. And so the Southeast is, we watch that very closely. And, the Southeast has to accept that modeling, but the federal government has been very forceful in pushing it in other areas too. So it is a risk there. Not to say that it's without benefit, but it is a risk, and the world as we know it can change. It does drive lower margin. I wouldn't necessarily say competition. It drives lower margin and drives many towards some sort of stranded cost. So far, we've been able to hold that off. Looking at sales, this chart has been illustrated enough, but the reality is when we look back at 2008, we were very confident of this sales growth, so much so that we entered into some contracts we'll talk about a little bit in terms of building capacity to meet the demand that is the top line there, which was just a continuation of the 30 prior years for our service territory, the state, the region, the country, of 3% per year growth of electric sales for a 30-year period. The rest of the industry did this and planned this way. We were not unique. And I would say that for many of the remarks here today, this is not unique to Jacksonville and unique to JEA. These trends are really across the country, and these decisions essentially that we've made are pretty much akin to what others have made. And we'll be very specific on a few things relative to decision-making in the future. The next chart shows, and again, it just supports, it's an external view of the, and this is 19, it's an external view of the sales, generally flat, but you get to see the mix in terms of the generation mix. How is electricity being made in the United States? The bottom gray, light gray, shows a significant reduction in coal utilized as fuel to generate power. The middle bluish there is a growth in the size of that part of the bar, and that's natural gas picking up. But the topper there is renewable, and it is growing and growing in acceptance, and certainly at this point in time growing significantly on the cost side of the equation. Next chart, again, in terms of what's going on with new capacity in the country, pretty much all renewable. There's some gas being done, but much less, no coal whatsoever. And most of the investment in new generating capabilities or capacity are renewables, wind, solar, and other. The next chart shows battery production. This is key. Prices are falling dramatically. The price curve over the next 5 years on most forecasts call it for sort of almost coming in at a 50% reduction to current pricing. And that will allow batteries to come into play to help support renewable energy more. The problem with a lot of renewable energy, wind and solar doesn't work well at night. And wind doesn't work well when the wind's not blowing. Captain obvious. But with cost-effective batteries, that solves part of the problem. And we're seeing across the country, in many areas that have organized markets in particular, the deployment of large-scale up to 50-megawatt batteries for utility scale, as well as consumers' adoption at a very high rate. Costs will continue to be driven down dramatically, and this is just illustrated.
Paul, the grid parity for energy storage systems, is that 3, 4, 5 years out?
My guess is about 5 years out. I think that, let's just look at batteries, I think about 5 years out. Right now, it's still compliance-driven. I mean, some of the big investments are still compliance-driven, or regulatory requirements are driven in certain parts of the country, or there are, I would say, in some of the organized markets, there are market inefficiencies, where if you drop a battery on one side of the interchange, you can make a lot of money because of the way it's priced in those markets. I think what we're seeing now is in terms of when we look at the residential adoption, in the next couple of years, you're going to be in the money. We have now, in our program, it's an incentive, and it's an incentive because it's still relatively expensive. In 3 years, I believe that will turn to become a subsidy because costs will drive down so much, and we'll have to revalue that. But I think the cost curve's about 5 years for repairing.
So in our budget assumptions, do we have a scenario that contemplates significant change in customer defections due to combined, renewable storage systems being economically viable to the mass market?
I think the two things.
Do we have a scenario? Not maybe it's not the base case.
No, we do a plus or minus 1% and 5% and 10% per se. So in a way, there's a proxy for that. I think we've studied it closely within our service territory in terms of the adoption. It still requires in the regulatory framework we're in, it still requires a pretty large capital investment. And so you get some limitation there, and then you get the capital investment in housing that has direct sunlight. So again, there's some balancing there in terms of, and some compliance within neighborhoods, et cetera. So we may not be as quick as but we are watching it for sure, and model in there. We model zero growth, and zero growth is, in addition to the 1%, 5%, and 10% reduction, zero growth is a balancing act. We're adding customers, so we're adding load, but then through, basically the adoption of more efficiency and/or defections, it's more than offsetting that, and has in the last number of years.
And that's the worst-case scenario because you're increasing.
Increasing costs.
Yeah, costs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Load growth versus, actual sales growth.
Yeah, and I would also add that the CapEx is actually a challenge for a utility, because if the barrier to disconnecting from the grid is a CapEx investment up front.
And it's nosediving.
Well, but it's nosediving, but the first people that then disconnect are your biggest users, right? So if your biggest commercial users, if your biggest residential users begin to disconnect, that doesn't change the debt load that you have on JEA. And so as you take away the heavier customers, it's actually those with the smaller utility bills that now have to share in the payment of that debt moving forward. So you actually end up stressing those that actually can least afford to have utility rates go up.
So pressure on rates going up and the ability to make a contribution, for example, grows exponentially.
Is stressed. Now, there's a couple things. In the short run, these customers that are using, contrary to some of the comments earlier today in the public comment, the customers that have adopted rooftop solar systems that that produce energy beyond their capacity to absorb and push that back out on the grid, they're using the grid, the JEA, their customers, for free storage. Right? So in effect, to the extent that you get high adoption rate, I think we've sort of slowed that down where we've got parity in the pricing on that. If you didn't, you'd have a more rapid because you got free storage. You push back free storage, and if we incent storage and actually get that customer off the grid, in the short run, we're better off because we can then make our engineering designs to make the system smaller as we contract and more efficient. But you do run the risk of leaving behind. No, it doesn't.
You still
No,
have that
no,
debt.
no.
And so you have a smaller number of customers that have to still.
And so here is,
Unless you're the provider of those systems.
you're absolutely right.
Oh, exactly.
Unless you're the
Exactly.
provider of those renewable plus storage systems and actually start to view that as part of the essential services that you get.
So, spot on. I mean, I was just going to, so we, in our studies and in our evaluations of the impact of this, the constraints we talked about earlier when we were on net fiber, being in the solar servicing business, solar space, whether it's rooftop, renting batteries. I mean, years ago, utilities used to rent water heaters. I mean, renting batteries or any derivation of that in terms of participating in basically the customer's use of electricity as opposed to the use of electricity that's generated at a central fossil station. And so the ability to provide that service, create that service, and get through our internal or home regulatory approval has been and will be a challenge.
Or we have many well-trained frontline individuals, both in high and low voltage environments, that would probably be very adept at servicing those types of
Absolutely.
systems.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
I just, this next slide is the EV, which is pretty fascinating. I mean, other parts of the country have adopted quicker than us. A lot of the EV adoption thus far, personal opinion, you've got heavy federal and state incentives, and you have extremely high electric and fuel pricing, you have high gas pricing, and you don't drive as much. We drive a lot, so there's a lot of sort of initial barriers here, and the price point is still pretty high to jump in. But that said, the major players, the major car manufacturing companies have announced and are investing billions of dollars moving forward with battery technology that we saw a few slides ago, as well as constructing vehicles that are going to jump into this space. So on this slide, you have two views, the EIA, which is the U.S. Energy Information forecast of that. That's a blue line, and then Bloomberg is far more optimistic here in terms of adoption, and that's the green line. There are two things. If you look at the vehicle as solely a means of transportation, that puts you in a box. If you start to really have a conversation about climate change and CO2 reduction, then you have to bring in the transportation sector. The transportation sector now is the #1 CO2 emitting sector on the planet. Up until a year ago, it was the electric generating industry. The electric generating industry, through its fossil fuel burning and coal, et cetera, globally, CO2 was the electric industry was the #1 emitter. And that's why the focus and the regulatory focused on the electricity, because minimal points in our country anyway, 1,000, 1,100 points to go ahead and restrict and tamp down. We are no longer there through closure of coal plants, through the gas pricing, through the adoption of the CO2 emissions for electricity continue to drop. They will continue to drop. The problem now for CO2 is the transportation sector. So I think Bloomberg, when they're looking at this, has a different view in terms of the cost of CO2, and ultimately will drive, I think, a higher sale. So there's balance here in terms of electricity pricing demand, but ultimately the cost of carbon. And I share that because there's no simple model here. It's a complex model, and a lot of push and pull of public policy at a federal, actually in some cases global, federal, state, local level, coming up with the right solution for our customers.
Paul, is there a similar line that says what the megawatt demand would be against these potential growth rates?
We don't, but we've done in a similar internal adoption rate within our service territory, not so much globally, and we've got to have a lot of cars from where we are. I mean, it's sort of a decade before we, even at these penetration rates, before from a generating capacity. The concern for us is more the distribution and how and when that energy is taken off the grid. Okay. So that'll be a price and control point in terms of if they charge at night through battery storage, from solar collection, and that transfer, then that's a good thing. If everyone comes to work during the day, tries to plug in, and we're generating with solar or don't have a direct route from, not generating with fossil, and don't have the direct route to transfer solar, then that's a problem for us. I think just the next chart is illustrative of the vast movement of what's going on in the space. A lot of movement in terms of products and services on the horizon. No real specific time, but sort of a near, mid, long term. All of these have implications. Whether it's flywheel storage, grid parity of storage, thermal, the micro, as opposed to even the mini, the micro nuclear reactors. Just a lot of activity, and any one could be a home run. Anyone could accelerate more quickly. Anyone could, be pushed out further as well, too. So it's really a tough time horizon of products and services, not only nationally when these will be available on a group, actually when they're adopted here in terms of our service territory.
Well, real quick, where do you, a lot of this is around power production and,
Yeah.
and energy storage. Is there somewhere where you address data in terms of, you know, the amount of data this utility collects in terms, on its consumer base, as well as the value of that relative to helping some of these things enter the market?
We don't. We're looking at that, and we're in our demand rate pilot activity in terms of recognizing and sort of some big data. There's a group looking at big data off of the meters in the advanced metering network. We're going to finish out in the next couple of years what we can get from that data and how quickly we can use it, and if we can use it, we've got privacy issues, et cetera. And then really it's the other side too, because we're getting some opportunity here in the technology to be actually on the other side of the meter through what's passing through the meter. So flipping to water and sewer trends, we had a substantial decline, but beginning to grow, similar to the growth in the in customer accounts. We've got some sales that are, our expenses are rising a little quicker than sales, squeezing margins across the industry. This is really an industry issue, and we are experiencing it here. We have water, we have a constraint. Water's a little different in terms of we're capped out. We have a constraint. We've got the cup, we got sort of, it's 15 years to go, plus or minus a few years. And once we get that, it's going to be tough to hold that, go forward, and I doubt very much we'll be looking at getting any additional water resource from the aquifer at that point in time. So that'll kick you to alternative water sources. We as a community need to do everything in our power to to stay away from having to use alternative sources, but be ready to and invest in creating alternative water sources. We still use way too much water on irrigation. We're blessed with the aquifer, and we need to, think about this. That's a real constraint in the business here. Water, wastewater regulations, we've got rising customer expectations, particularly locally, and then, between water and sewer, the long-term impacts of sea level rise, whether or not that's the floods that we've realized, just even blue sky flooding, but let alone the storm activity, climate change with sea level rise, but all of that not only affects what's above the surface, it affects what's below the surface in terms of pressures within the aquifer. So we've got to be mindful of that. On the next slide, we show the sales, and just recognize that we have the growth line there, similar rates within the country and the industry, but the top line is ultimately constrained by our consumptive use permit.
Paul, if I may, on this slide for the water sales, as well as the similar graphic on electric sales, it would be helpful for me if we could drill into the key variables which influence the overall sales to JEA, being the resident population in our service territory, and then from that understanding what is consumption on a per person basis, and then of that consumption, what is being provided by JEA as a source versus what is going to other sources, whether it's renewables on the water side, whether it's personal wells.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Will do. On the managing costs, just this next on 18, we're just consistent. There's no inconsistency in terms of what we've reported in our activity of what's going on nationally in terms of aging infrastructure. Although I will say the first point that when you hear national conversation about water and wastewater infrastructure, it really focuses in on aging infrastructure that has not been cared for over the years, infrastructure that is 50 to 100 years old. We have invested billions of dollars over the last decade and a half, and we are in much better condition than most on the national level. So really managing operational costs, system resiliency, our capital, and justifying really CIP going forward. We still have an aggressive CIP plan, capital investment plan, for the next 5 years to keep the system up and performing at levels that our community deserves. The next slide we've looked at just talks a little bit about a CUP and our supply and water sustainability. I've talked about that already. We talked about in the board discharge, nitrogen discharge requirements. At some point in time, our planning, in really our longer-term planning, is moving towards not how much nitrogen can be discharged to the river, but how do we deal with zero discharge? What happens on the day that the outfalls for our sewer or wastewater treatment plants, regardless of how the quality of the water, we can no longer discharge. And, that has happened in other parts of the state and other parts of the country. And so we continue to look at that in the longer-term plans and be aware of it. It's certainly an expense, a very significant expense, but that sort of matches up with at least placing some money on developing alternative water sources from our wastewater effluent. We've talked about the complexity of the pump station and where we are there in terms of sewer resiliency and previous board meetings, as well as the challenge in terms of some of the legacy systems on 22 in terms of Buckman that was designed 50 years ago for a very different environment. And so some of the design changes we'll have to go through and improve over time. Just a quick view of the contribution. Contributions continue from the 2008, 2007, 8, 9. The last significant increase in the basis for contribution. It's a 58% increase in total collected from our customers. That's a big number in looking at that in the environment that we're falling sales, tighter margins. So long-term, certainly a challenge at these levels. I think it's important, maybe for when you look at some of the benchmarking data, that the level of the contribution, which is really the franchise fee and the direct contribution, when added together, and that's the view that the street or the rating agencies do, we're sort of double the median for the public power industry. So it's 6% generally of sales. We roughly approach 12%. When we look at the other, and I won't go through this, but leave as more or less a leave behind of other activities that we contribute and participate in at the city level throughout the years, both economically and really socially. And then I want to turn to the market and wrap this up. What happened was there was a wow moment. And really the turn was probably the TECO acquisition. That's in our backyard. And we were aware of, and I think Mr. Zahn had indicated that the 2007 and 2012 valuations that we had and had sort of in the community debate was the 1 to 3 billion. And when the TECO deal was struck, and now granted that's an investor-owned to investor-owned, and so that's different. But we benchmark against TECO, and TECO's a little bit larger than us as the electric utility. They have gas, but we've got water sewer. And when we saw the valuations, that sort of, set us off to thinking, my goodness, that's a lot. And then so we dug in and said, what's going on? And really, the yields, basically all-time historic lows in terms of when we look at the debt markets. They're certainly up off their bottoms and at any point in time and have risen considerably on a percentage basis in the last 120 plus days. But, low rates drive utility share prices, which drive utility values, which drive the ability of utilities to pay for utility assets. On the price earning ratio, we saw the valuation of stock prices in the utility basket, the basket of utilities that are sort of measured investor-owned utilities, and saw a very significant. And we were surprised when you scratch your head, you say, well, these utilities have got the same issues that we have, and yet their multiple on share price has gone from 12 to 14 up to 22 to 25 times. One might say that's the cost of a 24 to 26, thousand Dow, but there's more than that in terms of the underlying capital markets. We did on the next page look and say, well, what's the impact on us? And we kind of thought, well, historically, from a public power perspective, our capital structure includes just municipal debt. We borrow debt, historically has been lower than taxable debt. A utility, an investor-owned utility, their capital structure is 60/40, 50/50, in that range of 60 debt, 40 capital, or 50/50. There's no precise amount. But by weighting that, historically on the left side of this chart found that the cost of capital for an investor-owned utility was higher than a muni. What's happened with the market in the last number of years, the weighted cost of capital in order to fund a utility operation has fallen from the investor-owned, which was higher than us, to below us in the recent 12 months.
Paul, let me just interrupt you there. That is a momentous change from a historical perspective, to say that municipal's cost of capital is higher than an investor-owned utility. I can't believe that's ever happened before in history. It looks like it flipped at the end of 2012 and has remained consistent for the last 6 years. That has tremendous implications. When we talk about changing market conditions, that has tremendous implications not only for our cost of capital, in terms of going out to fund what you've just detailed are tremendous capital expense pressures that we will be facing in the coming years, but also relative to our peers on the investor-owned utility side, how they can, quote, compete with us, and what threat that presents to JEA as a monopoly. And I don't want anyone to overlook the significance of that momentous change in what has historically been an advantage that we as munis enjoy.
I think one of the challenges, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, one of the challenges there, and it's been I'll say it's at least been a personal frustration of my peer group nationally, that the tax incentives provided for renewable energy have been directed exclusively at for-profit companies. So all of the money, the billions, tens of billions, at least tens of billions, might be hundreds of billions, out of the federal government that's gone to support and develop solar and wind and other renewable energies, have been exclusively towards private tax-paying entities. Now, I would argue that some of these large utilities don't pay a lot of tax because of the depreciation of the way they account for it. But it puts us further at a competitive disadvantage in terms of directly investing in renewables. And so it forces us as a sector, and this is JEA and the municipal sector, to acquire our renewable energy through developers who can then monetize those tax credits and provide some value.
And that's because we enjoy the municipal bond financing.
That's
tax
because
exemption.
we enjoy this great benefit, which is of higher cost.
Which now- Okay. By the way, is that weighted average cost of capital for the IUs, does that reflect tax benefit as well, or is it potentially lower if you include tax benefit? Lower.
Does not include.
Thanks.
Listen, you've been in the capital markets here for directly longer, maybe not longer than I have, but in terms of the muni market, closer. Anything in your history that shows this in effect?
Never in my career. Never seen it. And it's not comparing a cost of capital to a cost of capital, it's comparing a cost of capital to debt. And the weighted average cost of capital for an investor-owned utility today is lower than just our debt cost.
So again, I think it's really important here and for everyone here at the board, we're not drawing a conclusion here. I think this is just a data point, but it's a data point that covers up a significant portion of our business that either, we're going to live with this one way or the other. And so it's just important to say that the market has shifted significantly here.
Paul, let me interrupt you. I know we're nearing the end of
Yeah,
the
I'm
presentation and getting to the juicy parts on valuation, but I want to just pause and open it up for discussion and questions for the directors to talk about what you've summarized in terms of the trends, contribution requirement, capital markets. I'll start with Mr. Zahn this time, since I always start with Mr. Cumber.
I'm always used to going last due to Zahn being my last name.
We go by
So I'm not
first
offended
names
by
here.
it. Yeah, first name's double A, there you go. Do you have a comparable chart for the water side to chart 15? It'd be helpful at some point in time. It's not in here, I don't think,
It's
right now.
not,
But
and I don't know that we've identified one. We'll dig one out.
similarly, if you go to page 25, the price to earnings ratios of publicly traded water and wastewater utilities, which I know those multiples are actually almost 10x higher. And then also on the cost of capital, given the fact that large corporates are in fact playing in power, it'd be interesting to know relative, I was just looking up Alphabet and some of these other, and their cost of funding is 3%. So even if you were to compete against them relative to renewables and other things which they're undertaking on a national and international level, it seems we're at a different, would the conclusion be then you'd be at a disadvantage as well?
Yeah. What's our current weighted average interest rate?
Just below 4%.
Pretty huge, 80, 90 basis points?
Well, they have a couple $100 billion on the balance sheet too.
Yeah, oh, true.
Okay, just, those were clarification questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Ms. Green?
My question may be answered in the juicy part in Melissa's presentation. Understanding that industry trends can impact or not impact the value, our overall valuation. So are we taking that into consideration of what we think the trend forecasting is? Or are we just going to leave that up? Is that a part of the decision making on what our value is?
Can we do that one?
Yeah.
In my opinion, it absolutely has to be. Because in order to be able to make any kind of reasonable comparison between current state and how we might be able to grow the business in the future compared with some alternative capitalization structure, I think we've got to be able to take a position on what these trends mean for our business and the future of our business. So I think it does actually absolutely have to be part of the conversation.
So some of the trends that were discussed today, will that forecasting valuation be presented to us so that we can see what that amounts to, or is that in the next presentation?
I don't think it's in the rest of this presentation, but we certainly can dig in on that more.
Reverend Newbill? Ms. Flanagan? Mr. Cumber?
Just two quick things. We talked a lot about CapEx in the last several slides. Have we put together a chart, just kind of a one-page chart of, if someone were to step in our shoes tomorrow, like on a net present value, what is the CapEx that is needed in order to meet the demand as we see it today?
We've got a 5-year and a 10-year, I think, CapEx plan.
Which would, we do have 5, 10-year, and it would be some derivation of that.
Yeah, if we could just see that on an NPV basis. And did PFM subtract that CapEx when they came up with their valuation?
I
I
don't.
don't know.
Okay, it'd be helpful to know that. And then second, just because, the old adage, billion here, billion there starts adding up. Director Zahn mentioned, the valuation numbers previously. Were those done under the same methodology that PFM used? And was PFM the entity that actually came up with those other two values?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the methodology that was used specifically in either of those two valuations, but they were done by someone other than PFM.
Is that not city council auditor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was
City council
done
auditor
internal.
did those. Internal auditor did those. Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty sure.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next portion, I just wanted to make sure I understand some of the takeaways from your presentation on industry trends in particular. You can look at the charts, and we've been saying it for years at these board meetings, sales are flat. And even though we're adding customers, we're not expecting to add revenue from those customers, particularly on the electric side. Slightly different on the water side, but particularly on the electric side. Turnover of housing inventory to more efficient stock, more efficient appliances, conservation efforts, a lot of reasons, but clearly flat. If you've got flat sales growth, flat revenue, you're still carrying the expense side, particularly from legacy fossil fuel plants. I can't help but see that there's tremendous pressure, particularly when you look at our FCCRs on the bond, our fixed coverage ratio requirements. I don't understand how anyone can honestly say with a straight face, we will be able to sustain a $116, $117 million annual contribution into the future indefinitely. Am I missing something there? Absent tremendous rate increases?
Well, it's certainly going to be a pressure point. I think in terms of right now, and we have signaled in the last 3 or 4 budget cycles, that the fixed charge coverage calculation, because the contribution is a fixed charge, it's calculated even though in the waterfall it comes after debt service, and we've lost that argument with the agencies, it will pose a pressure on pricing and cost. Now, we have not gone to, the deregulated model in terms of generation assets, how you might restructure and do some other activities that might allow it to be sustained for a little bit longer, in terms of just, remember, the model we have is an integrated utility, and it captures the generation and the risks and benefits of generation, transmission, distribution. Is there ultimately a different model that is just distribution, the wires business, that can achieve some level of sustained, I don't know if you're going to have a continued growth there, but sustained at that level?
Well, I joined in
Yeah.
the initial remarks by Director Zahn.
Yep.
Staff and employees of JEA have done a tremendous job over the last 10 years in terms of improving customer service, keeping rates low, paying down debt, and improving our standing in the bond rating community. And I think Director Cumber was right to observe that we've got tremendous CapEx pressures that we're facing, and it's going to be a challenge going forward. I personally question those people who look at JEA and said it was a golden goose before, it's a golden goose now, it'll always be a golden goose. Based on what we've heard from you in this presentation regarding future trends and pressures, I'm not sure it'll always be a golden goose. There's some real challenges ahead, some real headwinds. So those are my thoughts. Unless anybody has anything else on trends, I'll move to the next phase of your presentation.
The only question I would have is perhaps do we need to reevaluate how the authority looks at budgeting, and rather than a plus or minus 5 to 10%, which is probably really good in a standard deviation operation in terms of which the world doesn't shift any much. Do we need to take into account some of these trends and run scenarios on budgeting, even if they're not utilized for actual annual budgeting purposes, but for risk analysis and strategy analysis for.
You mean risk-specific budgeting?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, if we were a publicly traded entity, we as a board of directors would have some pretty significant explaining to do to our shareholders as to why we would allow 10 years to go by with declining sales of 10%, and now they got the benefit of a value increase, but we'd be contemplating some pretty significant strategic shifts, and the menu is quite broad. But how do you think about that in terms of if we're going to if we're going to do budgeting? What are the scenarios that we undertake if we look 4 or 5 years out? It may not change the first year, but what are the impacts of high proliferation of EV? What are the impacts of grid parity of batteries and combined solar storage systems? What are the impacts of water supply issues that are 15 years out in terms of CapEx spending? And I know some of the staff's doing some really good work on that, but those are some pretty big shifts that my guess is are not necessarily assumptions that are contemplated in the existing budget. Is that fair?
Fair that they're not in the existing budget. We do run sensitivities around financial projections in particular to try to figure out what the business looks like should some of those things come to pass. But they're certainly not contemplated as part of the next fiscal year's budget.
And then as to Paul Cosgrave, what can we do as a company in order to buoy some of those risks with positive opportunities that we can take advantage of? And that's one example, but there's probably a litany of a dozen others that I can, and the team around here probably could come up with.
Mr. Cumber?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume the credit rating agencies are stress testing the budget that you guys give them and asking you to run different scenarios, or do they not? Yeah, right. So, having dealt with them, they sometimes come up with pretty extreme scenarios to, test out. So, so, I mean, I think they're there, but we haven't put it into our actual budget, as you say. But, I mean, what does give me comfort is we continue to get good ratings from the agencies, and I know they're stressing those budgets pretty heavily.
They're no pushovers, those ratings,
Yeah.
guys. Anything else on the trends before we move on to the valuation portion? Okay. Paul?
For
Yeah.
folks that are giving presentations, I don't think some of the folks in the back can hear some of the responses, and some of the questions is getting kind of quiet. If you could speak into the microphone, it'd be great.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I'm on 27 now, and I think we've seen these. I just want to, 27 is just a list of publicly traded and where we have activity of deals that have transpired over the last couple of years. And I would just point to the Emera, which was the sort of the wow in our backyard, but consistent as you go across the multiples clearly above what were comparable at the time that the past internal valuations were done. On the next one, 28, just the range, and more importantly here, just the work that was done, and this is right out of the PFM report. PFM did, and rather than conclusions here, just to the far left column, the discounted cash flow, price-earning ratio, cash flow multiple, and rate base. These are three different methodologies that were exercised by PFM with the same sort of data or input that they had to create an output of what they felt in terms of the valuation range would be if a discounted cash flow methodology was used by a potential or in an acquisition. The price earnings ratio, we talked about that in terms of the multiplier effect and what that has to do with respect to cost of capital. Cash flow multiple, again, looking at the cash flow, our cash flow, EBITDA before interest, contribution, amortization, depreciation, and sort of a multiplier of that. That's a common utilization in terms of a formula to evaluate what a potential value of a deal might be used in the market, maybe not so much to set the price, but in terms of the market to then assess what participants have done. And then constructing a rate base and, utilities, we're sort of on a cash flow model. We set our rates to cover cash. An investor-owned utility basically creates a rate base or really an investment bucket or balance sheet, and then they go to Public Service Commission and ask for a certain amount of return on that invested base. And so constructing that out of our balance sheet and looking at that and coming up with a range, all of those to say that the ranges fell fairly, there was good overlap. But I would point you to the top one, the discounted cash flow. At the end of the day, should this go forward, at the end of the day, in this space, somebody's acquired, they're looking at discounted cash flow in terms of an actual transaction. That's how much they would put out, how much they're going to get back. The question on the next page was, can you break out the valuations in terms of the systems, electric and water sewer, and just by overlaying those same calculations, you can see that the split there was the valuations were probably more heavily weighted in terms of the percentage of the total valuation towards the water and sewer assets. And there's a higher demand, higher multiples in that marketplace for transactions done in that space, albeit they've been smaller and fewer.
Is another perspective on slide 29 that the gross valuation between electric and water is fairly comparable, but because of Plant Vogel, the net on electric gets pulled lower?
Well, I would say some portion of the Plant Vogel in this exercise would have an impact there, but not all of it. I mean, because it's just basically the assessment of how much out of market that contract is versus the total contract. I think underlying, when you look at the two differences, there's much more volatility in the power space than there is in the water and sewer space. The water sewer space, is from an investment standpoint, you take the volatility out, and just even the multiples in the debt service coverage in our portfolio is less, and that creates a more sustainable value. So long-term, the big funds, that are looking at making investments, I'd rather park $1 billion in a water asset than an electric asset and receive a lower return because it's more stable.
Let me ask it a different way. When I look at the net from net of liabilities on an individual system basis from a range of 0.9 billion to 2.9 billion on sale of electric alone. If the community and city council wanted to move forward with a sale of the electric system and not the water and sewer system, as at least one councilman has suggested, that doesn't seem to give us a whole lot of bang for the buck. I don't see a whole lot of value in selling just the electric system and retaining the water wastewater. You'll retain a lot of the infrastructure in terms of the personnel needed to support water and wastewater. Suppose Mike gets to go home, but Brian's stuck here. What am I missing? I don't see a whole lot of bang for the buck in just selling the electric system.
Can I just make a quick comment? I
Please.
think it's worth noting that the arithmetic that's been done on this page was just purely based on the PFM report.
Okay.
They assigned a liability amount of $1.2 billion to the Vogel contract. That was, in their view, the amount of tax exempt debt that was issued associated with our contract piece, and it's more complicated than just subtracting that amount. But that's the arithmetic that's been done behind the numbers that are here.
Are you suggesting a net from a sale of the electric system could be higher or lower?
I'm suggesting that it's not as simple as deriving a conclusion based on the arithmetic that's here.
Okay, you're not suggesting, you're stating that. And ultimately, the market's the arbiter of the value here.
That's right, and I think that the swing of $1.2 billion may depend, for example, on whether or not the Vogel contract is transferred in connection with the sale.
Right. Okay. All right. I just wanted to say that because it's the first time I'm looking at these numbers presented in this workshop. They've not been presented before, to my knowledge.
Correct.
So I just want everybody at this table and everybody in the audience to understand that for those who are suggesting that you sell one and not the other, understand the consequences of that. It may revert back to the discussions that were had 5, 10, and 20 years ago regarding a privatization of JEA. It's just not worth it if you're trying to retain the water, wastewater, potentially.
And Chair, I might
Go
point
ahead, Mr.
out, a lot of this is at a high level. You're looking at DCFs and price to earnings and cash flow multiples, so a more thorough process would actually look at valuing some of the undervalued assets that currently can't be necessarily contemplated in an earnings element.
For example, is dark fiber included?
Yes. Well, we know for a fact it doesn't generate much revenue, so it would have very little impact here, but dark fiber trades at 80 to 100 times the earnings, right? So, and then you've got 2,000 real estate assets or something like that, which clearly don't generate revenue. So I think there's a number of other hidden elements within this authority that if you were to run a full process, you'd have a more clear understanding upon which to make a prudent decision.
Mr. Cumber?
Yeah, I'm not sure I just want to be clear, I followed the conversation on Plant Vogel and the 1.2 billion. Is it JEA management's position that the 1.2 is overstated or understated by PFM?
Since I think I answered the question originally, I'll just comment from my perspective. My perspective is that the view on the liability associated with that contract is not as simple as subtracting a fixed number from a gross amount in a table. So for simplicity, because this information was provided in connection with the information that was provided to council, we provided this breakdown here and just simply did the arithmetic based on what was in the PFM report. But my personal view is it's not as simple as that.
But you don't have a view yet if it's higher or lower?
I do not.
Okay.
But it is a liability.
It's a
We have
power
a
purchase
contract.
agreement.
It's a contract, it's an obligation to purchase power for a fixed amount for a fixed term. And at the current time, that amount is above market. And so the delta between the two would say that that's, yeah.
And the amount of the net present value discount on the price would depend on the structure of the ultimate transaction, is, I think, your point.
Yes.
So it could move one way or the other depending on the structure of the transaction. Can I exercise chair's prerogative? I just want to take a slight detour here, and because Vogel's brought up in the context of valuation, it is obviously a serious issue for JEA. It's a serious issue for this board. and Paul, you can probably do this in bullet point fashion, but can you take us back to the time when the decision was made to enter into the Vogel contract for JEA? Because right now, it's easy with hindsight to say that was a terrible idea, because none of us were sitting at the table, so we can all throw darts at it. But can you help us understand that and get that out on the record?
I think a few of us with seniority long enough to go back before this thing was executed agree it was a terrible idea, but,
Okay.
it was 10 years ago. Let me I'll just really be brief. Let me just dispel the fact that Georgia is this foreign land up to the north of us that, is a billion miles away that we don't have any relationship with.
I'm from Georgia, Paul.
I know. I want to dispel that. I mean, we're just 45 miles or whatever it is from the border. We have interacted with the state of Georgia and its electric generating providers for since 1982 in a meaningful way. We have, in the first years of our relationship with Southern, when we first built the 500 kV line, which is a transmission line that runs from the Georgia-Florida border to our service territory. A wonderful asset. We, in year one, when the first line was built, we imported 30% of the power needs for our service territory. In the second year, when the second line was put in, we imported 60% of our power needs. 60% of all electricity used in Duval County was imported from Georgia, from a Southern company. It went on to, for several more years at the 60 and 50% level, and sort of, we purchased in in the late 80s, plant share, and started, actually, we started taking power from that, and then subsequently purchased in 92, I believe, 200 megawatts from plant share. So our path went up from that and down with the reliance on Southern. Shortcut, fast forward, 24% of our annual electricity consumed in our service territory has been generated in Georgia. So I think that was the first point of, to make a point of Vogel. Vogel was not a unique transaction in terms of the state of Georgia. A little background in the participants within the Plant Vogel. Plant Vogel is a current operating nuclear facility. It's got 2 units. It is currently owned by MEAG, Municipal Electric of Georgia, Oglethorpe Power, and Southern. They made the decision back in the early 00s to consider going forward and approached us in the 2007-ish timeframe about buying a share. They came to Florida. They met with us in JEA offices and gave us an offer and a proposal to which we then engaged in contract negotiations. They were selling at the time 9.5% of the plant, or 206 megawatts. They were selling to us roughly 45% of their total share of the proposed 2 new units, Vogel's 3 and 4. 3 and 4, MEAG had about 22.5%. We were buying from them for 9.5% of total, 40% of their piece. MEAG constructed a project, if you will, a 40-year power purchase arrangement. And the first 20 years was allocated to JEA, and the second 20 years of that purchase power goes to their cities. They're a power agency. They've got 50 cities. The cities back up the second half of this 40-year purchase power arrangement named Project J. I want to go back and just in time, what was going on? What were we thinking at that time? At that time, growth was still at 3%. We were forecasting that in 2016 and 17, we would be producing 16 million megawatt hours of electric requirements for our service territory alone. This past year, we did 12. Okay, so 33% more was the requirement. So we were growing, we needed more. There was significant threat of CO2 regulation, not just in D.C., but locally. In the state of Florida, the governor had signed the executive order to require utilities by, I believe, 2017 to have 20% of their power produced by renewable sources. We were hoping to get nuclear in there, as it didn't produce any CO2. The federal government was not only debating, but acting on, and the House approved the cap and trade House bill, which would have required the closure of not only St. Johns River Power Park, but North Side 1 and 2 in the range of 2012 to 2014. Those are two CO2 intensive units, and in fact, North Side 1 and 2 are some of the most CO2 intensive units in the country. They are very clean compared to all the other constituents, but CO2, they emit a good bit. So we were struggling with CO2. At the time, the capacity and energy market for nuclear, as proposed, was competitive. Gas was at 8. It rose to, in subsequent years, from in 10 to 12 to $14 in 2010. Coal was at $100 a unit. I'll give you a figure today. Gas is 3 today, and coal is 40. We had environmental pressures. The economic utility, it was an economic utility decision. It was the cost of construction against, and I'll talk a little bit about who was behind the construction, our operating cost and interest producing output cost, which was in line with what we could produce and what we were producing, with about a $10 adder for CO2 cost, $10 per megawatt. So if we look to build and construct a gas unit here versus the investment at nuclear, given the gas pricing and cost of CO2, all we had to do was lay a CO2 cost of $10 over the time, and we were at break even. It was 10% of our energy, so it was a nominal, placement of capital. It wasn't bet the whole company. It was 10%, and we thought that that was reasonable. It, as I said, it had a 40-year life. It was a unified, I'll call it a unified mission in the Southeast to develop new nuclear to address CO2, CO2 emissions in our place. Wind and solar were not economic. Wind and solar solar just recently, just this last few months, has gotten economic, still heavily supported with subsidies from the federal government. But we're way out of the money, and we're not anywhere near helpful in terms of producing power in the Southeast. So Vogtle participants included Southern Company, and as well as MEAG and Oglethorpe. Dominion Power in Virginia entered into a COLA process, construction operating license process, which is about a $400 million process with the federal government for this technology to build nuclear power. Duke Energy entered into a COLA process, spending $400 million. Progress Energy entered into 2, one in North Carolina and one in Florida, over in Levy County. SCANA, IOU, as well as Santee Cooper, entered into a contract and an EPC construction project and started forward with theirs at the same pace, that a little behind what Vogtle did. The contracts were structured for EPC. When we look at what the actual construction contracts went forward, and I would add Florida Power and Light is finishing up their COLA for Turkey Point as well to build a nuclear plant. The contracts were structured in a way where there were portions that were fixed price. Labor was a fixed component. Materials were purchased early in the process and are still on site. It was a global entity in terms of Toshiba behind, and they acquired Westinghouse, so we looked at that. Westinghouse had a 100-year history in all aspects, had a big and has a big nuclear portfolio that they maintain a fleet in the U.S. and globally, so a big player. Southeast commitments, and the construction engineering firm Shaw and Webster, or Brown and Webster, had done the entire nuclear build-out in the prior 30 years, or 30 years prior to starting up again. There was enormous, strong support from the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Condition. There was financing available from the federal government for the BABS Build America bond structure and guaranteed loans provided by the federal government to support this program, and there's production investment tax credits that are being funneled in directly now at this project alone. That was then, now is now. The project has changed dramatically. No one foresaw the change in economics of $3 gas, $40 coal, and renewable and storage basically at the market today. So this took our market price deal, our competitively priced deal, and has placed it now out of market. Toshiba has bordered on bankrupt. The deal almost went broke in early 16. The ship was righted in early 16 with a global settlement of all of the participants. In 17, the wheels, or late 16, the wheels fell off again. Westinghouse went bankrupt. Toshiba had to step up in 17 and stroke a check for $3.4 billion to this consortium, $2 billion to the other consortium of the other plant being constructed. And we find ourselves now a number of years behind. The prospect forward will be a plant constructed under the direction of Southern Company, engaging new construction. Bechtel will be the constructor. Southern Power, Westinghouse will provide the intellectual component of the engineering and design. The federal government is still involved in loan supports. And so in summary, what we've got now is a 4 or 5 years away, a PPA for 206 megawatts of zero CO2 emission power. It represents at this time, because of the reduced requirement, 13% of our expected strategy, and it's currently above market with a zero cost of carbon of about 60%.
2022, when do 3 and 4 come on?
Yeah, I think realistically, the disclosure's 2020, the end of 2021, so like December 2021 and the end of 2022, and we continue to watch that optimistically.
Construction is ongoing.
Construction is ongoing. There are anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 people on site on a daily basis. Most of the major components with respect to the electric generating capability of the unit are on site, stored, ready to be put into service.
And Georgia PSC approved Southern Company's petition for...
Petition for cost recovery in middle of December. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Okay, that's helpful, because I think much has been made in the community discussion. City Council has asked questions about the Vogtle component. Just to be clear, the PFM valuation did include a discount of $1.2 billion, which may be higher or lower depending on structure of transaction, what happens between now and any transaction that may occur. So it did include that discount in determining the net value of JEA. I wanted this board to have the benefit of that background of what the circumstances were long before we were here, fellow directors, that gave rise to this contract that is now having an impact on the discussion around privatization. So thank you, Paul. I'll pause. Anybody have a question about just Vogtle, and then we'll return to the privatization summary.
Through the chair, Paul, on the topic of the pricing differential between our commitment for future power and how that's projected to be under market, is that purely a function of changing energy costs, or is there a component relating to the changes in construction costs that are baked into that as well?
It is both, and both went against us. So higher costs, so higher cost of the project, higher power cost, and at the time, lower energy costs because of natural gas, primarily natural gas.
And I can imagine that energy costs can and will remain subject to change into the future. So I would imagine that component could continue to fluctuate up until the time that we receive power. Is our commitment on construction costs capped, or does that have the potential to rise as well?
It has the potential to rise. Yeah.
Mr. Cumber, any questions on Vogtle?
Good.
I have one
Mr.
quick
Zahn?
one. In 2022, hopefully in 2022, upon completion, we're required to buy that power, right?
Yes.
Put or pay.
Yes.
So regardless of whether or not we would ever want to buy that power, because there's other sources of fuel available in 2022, we'll end up paying 60% above market.
The market yes.
Market as of today, whatever
Yes.
it might be,
Yeah.
wherever it is.
Yes.
2022.
That's correct.
And is that then the calculation that goes into this 1.2, or is that a different calculation if all of a sudden we're looking at consuming power? How would you factor that, quantify that, if it's now 13 or 14% of our total power consumption?
So the way I would look at it, and wasn't involved in directing PFM in terms of how they calculated and what they looked at. Vogel's a unicorn. It is a global unicorn. It's not a U.S. unicorn, North America, it's a global unicorn. And in looking at the electric system, it probably, in terms of this process, and potentially if we go the next step, that you have to ring fence that unicorn and sort of take that and put that on the side. And I think that otherwise you run the risk of constantly churning and muddying basically questions that can't be answered. And so that transaction ultimately has enough risk around it and uncertainty around it where it would be difficult for anybody to include that in the valuation. So I think you got to ring fence it and look at that individually. And what we can do is say that roughly, if you look at today's market and you look at today's cost go forward, the negative mark to market, assuming everything's equal for the next 25 years, is about it's 1.2, it's probably 1.3 billion.
Yeah, and maybe to frame it a different way, because your answer is predicated on maybe doing a transaction. The way going back to my opening remarks, which is,
couldn't agree more.
Assume the world stays the same. We remain to the JEA, the authority everybody knows and loves, and how does this board look at contemplating how to deal with that issue in 2022?
Yeah.
And in terms of, because if you stay status quo, ring fencing might actually in fact be a much more difficult task than if you in fact proceed on transaction.
Do you mind if I jump in with a comment?
Ms. Dykes?
Keeping things as status quo, figuring out how to deal with, in your words, the impact of this contract on our customers and our community has been a key focus from a financial planning perspective.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons that we did the rate restructuring that we did at the end of last year. That rate restructuring was targeted at repaying debt early so that we could alleviate some of those obligations, especially in the early years of that contract, so we can step into the contract obligations over time, recognizing we don't want to have an impact on our customers and our community that's so significant in a single year. It doesn't make the obligation go away. The obligation's with us for 20 years from when the contract start begins. But there are ways from a financial planning perspective that we can structure around it to mitigate some of the impact on the community, especially the financial impact. From a planning perspective, it does still deliver zero carbon power, which I know Paul mentioned a couple of times, and that's real from a risk management perspective, especially if you start talking about political risks, which we haven't talked about a lot. But if there's a change in administration, for example, in Washington, that could reintroduce the carbon regulation conversation all over again, in which case the value of that plant to JEA and to our community could change significantly.
Sure.
I don't want to get too hung up on Vogel. I promised everybody at the beginning we'd be out by 5, so let's keep going. I didn't promise that. We're going to make that. We'll be out by 5.
I thought you said out by 3.
Any other questions specifically on Vogel, Ms. Green?
No.
Reverend Newbill? I want everyone to understand that we are exploring options. We are on the record at JEA with the Georgia PSC and others that we don't like this contract. We were opposed to this project going forward, and we're exploring our options to get out of the contract. That's out there. It doesn't mean we're not going to honor the contract we've signed. We're honoring it, but we're looking for ways to get out of it, okay? And if there ever is a deal, just like any other debt, this can be ring-fenced, defeased, it can be addressed. If this is a transaction that the city council and community want to move forward with, you can address Vogel. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
Please move on to 31, the possible structures.
30, when we looked at that, we didn't look at this chart. This was PFM, but we had, going back really to, TICO and really what was going on in the market. We talked about, there's a tremendous value at JEA, and how the heck do you get at it? I mean, how do you get at this tremendous trapped value within the community, within JEA? And is there better use? It had nothing to do with selling. It had nothing to do, it's just sort of, we have a balance sheet, and is there a way to, and we have this tremendous value that has been a run-up in the equity markets and the debt market's lower, and we've paid off $2.5 billion in debt. We've just enhanced a lot of, and created a lot of value on the balance sheet. Is there a way to get at, how do we do that? And so really the first step in the process was really to look internally, I mean, in terms of how do you recapitalize? And I think in terms of looking at 31, really recapitalization of saying, what was the goal was, if you could keep everything the same, but you could pull some capital out of the structure and redeploy that within the community, wouldn't that be nice? And everything is a lot easier when you think about it than when you try to execute. But we thought about it in a way that there certainly is a do nothing here, and we pointed out if electric is around that $1 billion level, then maybe we still have to do something, but it may not be in this area of privatization. But under recapitalization, there probably is a way to keep the utility exactly the same. You got the brand the same, the utility structure the same, the commitment to downtown the same, interwoven part of it, but to basically replace the capital structure. And we can do that in a number of ways. Certainly a syndication into the private debt and equity markets and replace the capital structure. Yes, ultimately ownership might reside someplace else, but the commitment would be that the utility remains the same. You have a different reporting structure in terms of governance for PSC, et cetera. But all the jobs stay, and then you address and have the flexibility of addressing some of the opportunities that allow sustainability within the community and allow the jobs and the same economic development and gross economic impact, which is close to $1 billion, is a study of UNF put together, to stay and reside within the community. There's a couple of other structures. One is more of a financial that sort of looks much like the recapitalization, but and maybe borders a little bit on the independent subsidiary level here. But most of the operations and teams stay the same. You might get some redirection at the management level. The capital structure changes. You point in terms of governance to the Public Service Commission. You don't have the 2.5, 3 times coverage requirements on your debt that you currently do, so you're able to be a little more flexible. The sort of the fourth view here on the side is sort of an independent subsidiary. That looks like TECO. TECO, Emera is a utility. It's an international, it's a Canadian utility. They have assets globally. And they made the acquisition of TECO. The utilities, senior management changed, the holding company folks changed, but the operating folks are all employed. The TECO are still issuing TECO bills. You wouldn't know the difference. Then finally, an integrated strategic structure, which is, we identified Liberty. There's several others where essentially the utility is absorbed completely by another utility. And you lose the brand, the identification, and some of the investment in terms of more or less engineering support, administrative support, call center support for the cost efficiencies that an integrated firm might seek to achieve their economics. This is not to say that we need to push any one of these buttons, but in looking at the market and looking at the deals that were presented by PFM in their study, there's a range of opportunities, and some of these fall into both the economic as well as the impact on employees and customers and community, and that's a big part of the decision-making process.
Let me ask you to pause right there on this slide. So let me make sure I understand what you're saying. The 4 different models presented, and I assume that there's a spectrum here, and you could get some hybridization between the models, but there are certainly options, as I hear what you're saying, if I understand it correctly. There's certainly an option that would maintain a JEA brand, JEA employees, some local answering to the community, some perhaps local influence on the board, et cetera. That's your recap and perhaps financial model. It seems like it checks the boxes. I was asked by someone recently about the issue of privatization and why we even needed to have the discussion. And I answered, if you could keep the employees in place and keep the rates the same as your neighbor in the adjacent county and put $6 billion in your pocket, wouldn't you want to have that discussion? It seems to me like in your example of possible structures, that possibility exists. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's worthy of having the discussion. Mr. Cumber, possible structures?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, but the one thing that I didn't see in here that you mentioned is keeping the rates the same. And, you know, to be clear, you keep rates the same, that $6 billion number probably comes down. So, I think there's some really good structures here. You know, from my experience, the more conditions you put up front, the significant value deterioration you're gonna get. It's almost as if you wanna see what the value is, and then do your add backs and deductions and not do it the other way around.
Sure.
And so, you know, I think each one of the last three on this is regulated by the Florida PSC. I think one of the things we would have to make a decision on as a city council and a JEA board is if we felt comfortable that the PSC would provide that regulatory environment, you know, then I think that's what, you know, you move forward without putting a governor on rates because you have this regulatory entity that would do that. So I get a little nervous when we say we're gonna sell the utility and then, you know, set rates for the next 20 years, 10 years, 30 years. I don't know if that's, I mean, has that been done in a transaction before?
Well, I think to be realistic, I'm not going to sit here absent this conversation and commit that we'll keep rates for 20 years either.
Right,
I mean,
so,
yeah,
like, I think we just have to be-
What has been committed in some of those is 3 to 5 years. And I think that's almost the standard.
It's 3 to 5.
It's 3 to 5.
Okay.
And employment standards, again, you know, 2 years. And I'm just looking at deals that have been structured and done, yeah.
You know, maybe that would be helpful for us, is almost to have a kind of a term sheet of some of the last transactions to understand what conditions were part of those transactions and see if there are any that are similar across those transactions.
And so there's probably two things that I would say that if you think about this sort of blending in some of the flexibility to execute, to take advantage of some of the opportunities, I think that's board members on. But the structure that gains the most support for all of the constituents, if you're going to go down this path as well, too. I mean, because you could have the best, you know, you could do the deal that gets the highest dollar value, but then it has extremely adverse conditions to most of the participants. And ultimately, we have speed to execution. And the longer this goes, now, I'm not going to try to forecast the next 6 or 12 months or, you know, 18 or 24 months in the market, but the market has moved against us, you know, in the last, you know, 4 or 5 months, and trends are, you know, rise in interest rates and the equity market somewhat challenged getting back. So I just sort of, there's some other big things out there that, as opposed to just the clinical, let me get the biggest dollar amount and then try to come back, as opposed to maybe structure in a, you know, sort of a different way. So 2 ways to look at it, that's all.
That's a good point.
And
Mr.
then,
Cumber?
and then my last question is, and I'm sorry, I don't know this, but on the chart that you had given on some of the comparisons and then the examples at the bottom, which of these, if any, were municipal-owned utilities that were taken private?
Citizens is probably the best example. They were municipal and taken into a public trust, so it's not really a private entity. It's a transition to a public trust.
Okay. And where are they located?
Indiana.
Indianapolis.
And then on any, where, I forget what page that was, where we had none of those were? No. Okay.
No.
That was it. Thank you.
Ms. Flanagan, structures.
There's been discussion and questions in the community about FEMA reimbursement eligibility. Can you explain which resulting structures are eligible for FEMA reimbursement, if any?
None of these structures would be able to access FEMA. So historically, and really in Florida, the rules are that you accumulate what your storm costs are against the schedule from the Public Service Commission, the regulator. You put those costs in for recovery, and they deem them appropriate and allow you then to charge back your customers on a monthly basis over, I think, a 4-year term.
Anything else? Reverend Newville, any questions on the structure? Ms. Green?
Yes, my question is similar to Board Member Flanagan. So there are other obligations that we have within the community that's come up in terms of the sewer. Are those taken into consideration as well?
No, there's no extraordinary expenditures. We haven't really made any decisions or put any numbers in with respect to obligations outside of the current scope of business. So in the event of expanding water and sewer lines, we funded that through last year with a $15 million special contribution to start that, and then the city's matching that. That's not included prospectively. Any cost associated with overhead to underground, that's viewed under current programs to be borne essentially by the customer. So the answer is no.
I'm sorry, are you referring, there was a question raised at the February 14 council meeting by
Exactly.
Councilman Brown, who said there's a liability owed to the citizens, particularly of Northwest Jacksonville, for the expansion of water and wastewater that's never taken place.
Exactly.
Okay, so she's referring to, and we don't carry that on our balance sheet.
We do not carry that on the balance sheet. JEA as an entity, and one of the issues, and I don't mean this to be technical by any, but JEA as an entity was not around during consolidation, consolidation, wasn't around until 1998, and in essence, we did a quasi-privatization at that point in time. I mean, the city spun out a department into an operating authority, independent authority construct, which had its delegated responsibility to issue bonds against its bond resolution, its own capital structure, and to operate independently and autonomously. And so there really was no carryover of any promise from that to the books and records or obligations of JEA. We recognize it as a community issue, and really a broad community issue, not necessarily to be borne by the sewer customers of JEA. That's really a subset of our customers right now. It's 235-ish thousand customers versus the 465,000 electric. When you look to expand, if it were just, say, sewer department from Bryan, water sewer, go ahead and lay lines, well, that charge is going to go back to the customers that have existing sewer systems that are paying for it. And so that's part of where that rub is.
So the unfulfilled promise of consolidation was not a promise made by JEA, nor a liability carried on our balance sheet. So it did not get taken into consideration in any of the valuations we've talked about today.
Nor we have any guarantees that it will ever be fulfilled.
Well, no, but that's certainly an option that you could impose, as Director Cumber said, you can impose a lot of, or attach a lot of conditions to any transaction, and that will drag the price. Or you can certainly make your opinions known at City Council. If this is a transaction that they want to go through and unlock some of that trapped value in JEA, here's how we want it to be spent. Not a decision for this board.
And to be, just to be clear, from a JEA perspective, we have always been willing and strongly desirous of moving forward with that. The question has always come back to the capital funding and how to raise the capital appropriately. The two successful out of 3 tries, the Better Jacksonville plan accumulated $80 million, which we managed and did great things with. We saw a picture earlier in terms of the new program for water sewer expansion. But we struggled with one in the middle of that in terms of the Water Sewer Expansion Authority. It was an independent authority, and it was based upon JEA providing business services, engineering services, and construction services. But the capital was never found. And we thought at the time we could raise capital from the state and federal government, and ultimately that was disbanded. So it's near and dear to my heart. I lived in a septic tank phase-out area for years and years as a kid, so it's horrible.
Director
you.
Zahn?
To be clear, the FEMA question, there are ways to structure some of these different buckets where FEMA actually maintains an option, or the FEMA reimbursement is, that option's maintained, right? In terms of you could have a partial sale or other things that might not actually hit the thresholds that where FEMA might look at it as disqualifying the entity from a reimbursement. Is that possible?
I think really my comment was very specific to, you either have a municipally owned, city-owned authority or an investor-owned.
So you're just doing
Yeah,
100 or
that's the-
0, you're
yeah.
not saying, because there
But
are
I-
some.
But I'm not
partial-
aware of any investor-owns that have have that access to, it's really, there is a pretty clean line between, you either don't or do, but can you structure around it? I haven't seen it, but I wouldn't, in today's world of structuring and creativity, I wouldn't knock it out.
And then I noticed that, and the word privatization drives me nuts, but monetization, because it's really, that's what we're talking about. IPO, is that off the table? Is that not something that's actually a feasible option for monetizing the value of the assets?
I think there's an opportunity there. I think that,
Because it creates permanent capital as opposed to fund structured lifetime capital.
yes, yeah. It is, I think it does, but I think the initial, because again, the deal it struck's could be, if it were to go that far, would be a unicorn again to the market. I think you might get a pretty good haircut. But it is a possibility.
But it could have other benefits, to your point, to
Absolutely.
the other stakeholders that need to be satisfied along the
Absolutely.
way in terms
Absolutely.
of employees, unions, city retained ownership, local control, all those things.
And I think the syndication could do that as well in terms of some of the funds that support all those activities. I mean, absolutely.
Okay.
To be clear, Director Stein, you're talking about a partial IPO of a minority stake, so that it retained the municipal status?
No, I'm just saying, I think there's a fifth bucket here
Okay.
that actually, the city, it would have to be up to the city council as to what percent, but, in many IPOs, the current holder of the equity has the opportunity to retain some portion of that equity, and sometimes a requirement by the underwriters to do so for some period of time, and, there have been IPOs where it's been over 50% retained by the initial owner, and somewhere goes all the way down to 10, but I mean,
The challenge we might have is a municipal entity has extreme difficulty, if not impossible, to hold stock.
right, but there could be a trust, and then
Yeah.
similar to citizens, you
yeah,
could create a
yeah,
trust and
yeah.
do so.
Yep,
I understand the point.
Sure.
There are complexities with all of these. that are-
absolutely, absolutely. And then,
If you want to bullet point the challenges, and we'll chat about that and
yeah,
wrap it up.
and I'll just say the challenges, or, we probably should have said considerations. I mean, I think that employees are first and foremost, employment security, as we have this dialogue today in the ongoing public debate. It's important to know that the board and those that are engaging in this conversation have our employees, the JEA employees, the men and women that provide just life-sustaining critical services 24 hours a day to our community, that restore power on a day like today. Most people were hiding inside, that are first and foremost in terms of the outcomes of these discussions. Drilling down a little bit more, pension continues to be a source of concern for employees, as is health insurance. Health insurance, probably more from a retirement standpoint. There is access back because of the state government, municipal government is required to give access back to the group plan for a period of time. And quite frankly, a number of our employees, the most senior employees, don't have access to Social Security, but don't have access to Medicare either. And so that's an issue and concern, and a very emotional concern. And when we talk about the impact on the employee base, just functioning in the positions and the jobs and the tasks that they do in the safety-sensitive areas, I mean, we need to be mindful. Customer rates and reliability, certainly a concern, needs to be a consideration addressed in any conversation. Regulatory approvals, more or less secondary, but will be significant, and really the outlying counties in terms of the interlocal agreements are 2,000 plus real estate holdings, as well as the other easements that we have. Vogel, we talked about, and just pension, I don't think we need to go into detail on that one, Mr. Chairman. And I think that finishes the slides and the material that we put together here. Again, I would say that I think the dialogue's been great today from my perspective. I just hope that those that have participated here know that we're having this conversation. We wouldn't be having this conversation if the employees hadn't driven so much value through the outstanding operational performance that have allowed us to pay down debt to the tune of $2.5 billion. That the capital markets weren't in this unique alignment at this point in time for us to have this conversation. But it's been through the great work of the men and women of JEA. I have said ever since I've been honored to have this position that what differentiates JEA from other organizations, what makes JEA great is its people. Every utility has pipes and wires and poles and transformers and big operating generating plants and pumps and whatever. But what makes us better than most, and in some cases when we compete, better than all, it's our people. And it's the dedication and the passion that they bring to work. There were 2 or 3 things that were teed up in the meeting today. Many utilities, many city governments wouldn't bring those up, wouldn't execute, and wouldn't put the discipline, the time, and structure in that our Treasury team did to save $60 million, that let that opportunity pass, and no one would know. The passion that everyone brings from everyone in the organization every day is just an honor for me to serve them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. McRoy. Concluding remarks, questions, Mr. Cumber?
Mr. Chair, I don't know if this is something that the rest of the board members would want to do, but I would like the opportunity, Paul, to meet with PFM to ask some questions about their analysis, just as part of the fact-finding mission. I'm fine with doing that kind of one-on-one with them, but I do feel that that's kind of a missing part of the conversation, of us just being able to get some dialogue directly with PFM.
Are you saying that you've got some specific questions, or you want to engage in a dialogue? Because my preference would be that we submit questions, get their responses, and make that public.
I'm fine with that, just the ability to get clarity on some of their, on
I
some of
would
the
welcome
issues
it.
in their report.
I suspect you have very good questions. I suspect that Councilman Crescent-Benny and his committee would welcome it as well, in addition to questions they themselves may have. So
Okay.
I'd suggest you do that.
Great.
Ms. Flanagan?
I'm appreciative of the forum that we've had today, the opportunity to have an open dialogue and express recognition for the time and commitment, especially that all of the employees of JEA have put into accumulating this information. I know that special projects are indeed special projects, and it doesn't mean that your day-to-day obligations don't have to get fulfilled. So they're running double shifts right now.
Echo that remark. Thank you, Ms. Dykes and your team. Reverend Newville?
Yes, I think she covered basically what I want to say about additional work, and covered very well. Matter of fact, it's been very informative. And again, I want to echo what Paul said about that 60 million just won't leave my head for some reason. And took a lot of work, a lot of dedication. And I just feel good about being on this board and where the employees and management are headed.
Thank you, Reverend Newville. Ms. Green?
I just think today was very fruitful and appreciative for all the information provided.
Thank you. Director Zahn?
Relative to public documentation requests, production for the board for conversations, interfacing with city council, how much additional FTE support have you had to draw on in order to support this conversation?
How much, I'm sorry, how much additional?
FTE, full-time employees have you had to draw on internally in order to support this conversation?
Did you add any staff to do all this?
We didn't add staff, no, dozens, and I just did, that one's tough to say. We're just not doing a lot of things that we would like to do. And so
So-
I think ultimately we'll be missing opportunities.
So as a board member, that was what I figured the answer was going to be.
Yep. Yeah, I just,
I'd love to find a way for you guys to get back to the 2013 strategic plan. And that maybe goes back to my opening remarks, which is, let's get you guys back actually running a really solid utility and talk about some of these outlier events and maybe some of the resulting capitalization structures in a format that allows for our utility to actually perform the services that we expect it to perform when we flip the light switch on. And that would, and I don't know that, there are a number of structures to do that, but I just think that that would be a paramount, and that might also help in employee morale. Because, and I'll close with, this is a very exciting conversation, and I know a lot of people fall one way or the other in terms of how their excitement takes them. But, to be able to have the debate is a very special place to be, and everybody, from employees on the front line to the executive team should relish in the fact that you get to have a voice. And that's a great thing to be a part of.
couldn't agree more. I think if this team weren't so great, we wouldn't be here. I mean, they produced tremendous results. And I, just as you were talking, thinking a little bit more, I probably didn't answer your question well. It really doesn't matter how much time I'm spending on it. The time that the lineman who's up in the bucket today is spending thinking about this when they're 1 foot away from tragedy, that's the concern.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with my time. Sorry, Melissa, it doesn't have to do with your time.
She said I have for her.
And it doesn't have to do with anybody's time that works in these, I'll say these cushy, compared to, people that are out in the plant, people that are crawling through turbines, that are putting themselves on the line at rest, people that are down in holes 8 feet below grade in mud and other debris because of a pipe break in the middle of the night. And they're thinking about this. That's the cost.
100%. I'll go back to that framework of 6 things. If people outside of this board don't think maintaining value or preserving the value that has been created is a priority, well, then that's an easy conversation as to why we should stop the conversation. If people think that we shouldn't have a strategy that continues value growth, or shouldn't be addressing liabilities, or shouldn't be having a business model that addresses the emerging issues that you did a great job of covering, well, we can start striking off some of those elements that, aren't important to, members that aren't part of this board relative to managing this, and it gives us some guidance from our shareholders as to how to actually manage the board in terms of being fiduciaries to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Zahn. I appreciate everyone's attendance here today. You remarked on staff's dedication. They've certainly spent countless hours. Each of you have day jobs and other things that you could be doing, so I thank you on behalf of JEA for the time that you as directors have given. As I stated at the outset, the purpose of this workshop is to facilitate discussion and dialogue amongst the directors. I think we've had an opportunity to do that. I appreciate all the effort that went into this presentation. This is ultimately not going to be our decision. It'll be Councilman Crescenbenny and his colleagues. Our opportunity here is to facilitate discussion, answer questions, and educate all the stakeholders. So to that end, I think we've gotten a good start. Thank you. This workshop is adjourned.